Revenge, Vera Rice had learned, was a dish best served with diamonds and a side of absolute devastation. The custom Rolls-Royce Phantom glided through Savannah's moss-draped streets like a predator returning to familiar hunting grounds. Behind bulletproof glass tinted darker than midnight, Vera Rice adjusted the Cartier watch on her wrist. A watch that cost more than most people's annual salary, purchased specifically for this moment. 8 years. 8 long years of building an empire with one singular purpose: to destroy the man who had tried to erase her from existence. Every mile of this journey was calculated, every turn deliberate. She'd driven these same streets 8 years ago in a battered Honda Civic, crying until her eyes burned, carrying his children in her womb and his rejection in her heart. That broken girl was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that power wasn't inherited. It was taken by those brave enough to seize it. The Heritage Foundation Gala. The same event where she'd met Colton Jordan 8 years ago as a naive literature professor with stars in her eyes and love in her heart. Tonight, she would return as something else entirely. A billionaire media mogul whose net worth had surpassed his, whose influence stretched across 3 states, whose very name made Fortune 500 CEOs return her calls within the hour. Through the tinted windows, she watched Savannah's elite arriving at the convention center in their luxury vehicles, completely unaware that their social order was about to be restructured by the woman they'd once dismissed as that scholarship girl. Senator Patricia Morrison stepped out of her Mercedes, wearing diamonds that paled in comparison to the ones adorning Vera's throat. Judge Marcus Wellington, Colton's former brother-in-law, adjusted his bow tie with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences. All of them complicit in the world that had tried to destroy her. All of them about to witness her resurrection. "Mrs. Rice, we've arrived," Phoenix, her personal assistant, announced from the front seat. Even he, a man who'd worked for tech titans and oil executives, spoke to her with a reverence usually reserved for heads of state. He'd been with her for 3 years, lured away from a Silicon Valley mogul by the promise of being part of something unprecedented, the systematic destruction of old money by new power. Vera smiled, the kind of smile that had graced magazine covers and struck fear into boardrooms across the South. Perfect timing. Let the show begin. The valet who opened her door was the same young man who'd worked this event 8 years ago, though he didn't recognize the transformed woman emerging from the Rolls-Royce. His eyes widened as he took in the vision before him. A queen returning to claim her throne, wearing power like other women wore perfume. The Rolls-Royce door opened, and Vera stepped onto the red carpet in a custom Valentino gown the color of fresh blood. The dress, designed specifically for tonight, hugged every curve she'd earned through 8 years of 15-hour workdays and iron determination. Diamond earrings caught the camera flashes, each stone carefully selected because they sparkled like the tears she'd cried the night Colton Jordan destroyed her world. But these weren't tears of pain. These were diamonds bought with the fortune she'd built from his betrayal, worn to blind him with the light of everything he'd lost. Conversations stopped like record players with their power cut. Society photographers scrambled for position, their expensive equipment clicking frantically to capture what they instinctively knew was a historic moment. The woman who disappeared 8 years ago as a broken graduate student had returned as the most powerful media mogul in the South, and everyone wanted to document the resurrection. "Ms. Rice, when did you return to Savannah? Ms. Rice, is it true you own half the historic district? Ms. Rice, what brings you back to the Heritage Foundation Gala?" Each question came from reporters whose paychecks she could now approve or terminate with a phone call. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same media that had once ignored her story was now desperate to tell it, completely unaware that she controlled the narrative they thought they were chasing. She paused at the entrance, every movement calculated for maximum impact. 8 years of media training had taught her that power wasn't just about having it It was about wielding it like a scalpel, precise enough to cut without the victim understanding they were bleeding until it was too late. "Savannah has always been home," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd addressed Congress and commanded boardrooms filled with men twice her age. "Sometimes you have to leave to become who you were meant to be. Tonight, I'm exactly where I belong." The words were chosen carefully, each syllable designed to convey multiple meanings. To the reporters, it sounded like a successful woman returning to her roots. To those who knew the real story, it was a declaration of war delivered with silk-wrapped steel. Inside the ballroom, crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across walls that had witnessed a century of Savannah's most elite gatherings. The same walls that had heard her heart break 8 years ago would tonight witness her complete and utter triumph. Every detail was as she remembered. The marble floors imported from Italian quarries, the gold leaf moldings applied by artisans whose families had decorated palaces, the oil paintings of long-dead aristocrats who'd built their fortunes on others' suffering. But now she belonged in this space in ways she never had before. This wasn't infiltration, this was reclamation. Vera moved through the crowd like a queen among subjects, and the comparison wasn't metaphorical. Through her various holdings and shell companies, she now employed or influenced the livelihoods of nearly 30% of the people in this room. Business leaders who'd once dismissed her approached with carefully crafted smiles and business cards. Old money socialites whispered behind fans, trying to reconcile the powerhouse before them with the quiet professor they'd once overlooked. Mrs. Catherine Beaumont, whose family had arrived in Savannah before the Revolutionary War, approached with the cautious deference of aristocracy, recognizing new power. "Ms. Rice, what a wonderful surprise to have you back in Savannah. Your success has been remarkable." "Thank you, Mrs. Beaumont. I've always believed that remarkable circumstances require remarkable responses." The coded language wasn't lost on the older woman, whose own family had survived Sherman's march by adapting to changing power structures. She understood that tonight's gathering had shifted from social event to changing of the guard. But Vera's attention was focused on one man across the room, frozen in conversation with the mayor, his champagne glass suspended halfway to his lips like a toast to his own funeral. Colton Jordan. He'd aged, she noted with satisfaction. The boyish charm that had once made her weak in the knees had been replaced by the hollow look of a man carrying guilt like a stone in his chest. His marriage to Constance Wellington had given him the society status his father demanded, but even from across the room, Vera could see the emptiness in his eyes. The look of someone who'd traded his soul for acceptance and found the bargain lacking. The expensive tuxedo couldn't hide the weight loss that spoke of sleepless nights and bourbon dinners. His hands shook slightly as he raised his glass, a tremor that betrayed the anxiety medication she knew he'd been taking since his therapist had prescribed it 3 years ago. Yes, she'd been watching. She'd been watching everything. Good, she thought. Let him feel a fraction of what he put me through. Their eyes met across the ballroom, a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. She watched his face drain of color, watched his hand tremble slightly as recognition hit him like a physical blow. The conversation around him continued, but Colton Jordan was no longer present. He was 8 years in the past, staring at the woman he'd destroyed, trying to reconcile the broken girl in his memory with the goddess of vengeance before him. Vera's smile was radiant and terrible. She glided toward him with the confidence of someone who owned half the room, literally. Through her various shell companies and investment firms, she'd been quietly acquiring properties throughout Savannah's historic district for 3 years, the museum where they'd had their first date, Heron, the restaurant where he'd first said he loved her, also hers. Even the apartment building where she'd lived as a graduate student now belonged to her portfolio. Every step toward him was a step closer to justice, every heartbeat a countdown to his reckoning. "Excuse me," she said to the mayor, her voice honey-sweet with an edge of steel. "I was hoping to speak with Mr. Jordan about a business opportunity." The mayor, recognizing power when he saw it, immediately stepped aside. "Of course, Ms. Rice. Colton, you remember Vera Rice? She's become quite the success story." Success story. If only he knew that every dollar in her billion-dollar empire had been earned with Colton Jordan's destruction in mind. "Hello, Colton." Her voice carried 8 years of pain transformed into power. "You look surprised to see me." He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again like a fish gasping for air. The great Colton Jordan, heir to a tech fortune, reduced to speechlessness by the woman he'd tried to erase. "Vera," he finally managed, her name falling from his lips like a prayer or a curse. I didn't know you were in Savannah." "I own Savannah," she replied with casual certainty. "Or enough of it to matter. Funny how things change when you have the right motivation." The color that had returned to his face drained away again. Around them, the gala continued. Laughter, clinking glasses, the soft rustle of expensive fabric, but in their small circle, the air crackled with tension thick enough to cut. "I need to speak with you," he said quietly, desperately, privately. "There are things I need to explain." "Explain?" Vera's laugh was like crystal breaking. "Oh, Colton, you had 8 years to explain, 8 years to find me, to make amends, to show even the slightest remorse for what you did. Instead, you married your debutante princess and played house in your family mansion." She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume, Chanel No. 5, the same fragrance she'd worn the night he'd told her to handle the situation or lose him forever. But now, it carried undertones of something darker, more complex, the scent of a woman who'd learned to weaponize everything, even memory. "The woman you tried to destroy no longer exists," she whispered, her voice carrying a promise that made his blood run cold. "In her place stands someone far more dangerous, someone who learned that the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting everything." She stepped back, her smile returning to its public brilliance, the mask of social grace sliding back into place with practiced perfection. "Enjoy the gala, Colton. I know I will." As she walked away, her blood-red gown trailing behind her like a queen's cape, Vera felt the first sweet taste of justice on her tongue. This was only the beginning. By the time she was finished, Colton Jordan would understand exactly what it felt like to lose everything that mattered. Behind her, she heard the sound of his champagne glass hitting the marble floor and shattering into 1,000 pieces. "Perfect," she thought. "Just like he shattered me." But unlike her 8 years ago, Colton Jordan would never get the chance to rebuild. The Queen had returned to claim her throne, and this time she would show no mercy. Chapter 2. The Billionaire's Nightmare. The past, Colton Jordan discovered, had a way of returning when you least expected it, dressed in designer armor and wielding enough power to end you. The sound of shattering crystal echoed in Colton's ears long after the champagne glass fragments had been swept away by attentive staff. His hands shook as he stared at the spot where Vera Rice had stood moments before, her words still burning through his consciousness like acid through steel. Someone who learned that the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting everything. The gala continued around him in a haze of meaningless chatter and clinking glasses, but Colton felt as though he'd been transported to another dimension, one where his carefully constructed world was built on sand, and Vera Rice held the power to wash it all away with a single wave. "Darling, you look absolutely pale." Constance Wellington Jordan materialized beside him, her perfectly manicured hand settling on his arm with the practiced grace of a society wife who'd spent 5 years perfecting the art of public appearances. "Whatever is the matter?" He looked at his wife, really looked at her for perhaps the first time in months. Constance was beautiful in the way that money could buy. Personal trainers, the best plastic surgeons, couture gowns that cost more than teachers' annual salaries. Everything about her was perfect, calculated, and completely empty. Standing in Vera's presence for those few minutes had reminded him what real beauty looked like. The kind that came from strength forged in fire, intelligence sharpened by struggle, and power earned through pure determination. "I'm fine," he lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Just tired." Constance's blue eyes narrowed slightly. She might be vapid, but she wasn't stupid. "You haven't been fine since that woman walked into the room. Who is she, Colton? And don't you dare lie to me." Before he could answer, the evening's program began. The Heritage Foundation's president took the stage, but Colton heard nothing. His attention was fixed on Vera, seated at the head table like the queen she'd somehow become. She belonged there, he realized, with a sick twist in his stomach. She commanded that space with an authority that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the kind of power that couldn't be bought or inherited. When had she become this? When had the gentle literature professor who'd cried in his arms become this untouchable goddess of vengeance? The answer came to him like a punch to the gut: when you destroyed her. The Heritage Foundation is proud to announce our largest single donation in the organization's 150-year history, the president continued, his voice carrying across the hushed ballroom. Ms. Vera Rice has pledged $50 million to restore and preserve Savannah's historic properties. The applause was thunderous. $50 million. Casually announced like it was pocket change. Colton's own net worth, while substantial, paled in comparison to the kind of liquid assets that announcement represented. Vera stood to acknowledge the applause, and in that moment, Colton saw exactly what he'd lost 8 years ago. Not just a woman, a force of nature, not just love, a partnership that could have ruled the world. As the evening continued, he found himself studying her from across the room like a condemned man watching his executioner sharpen the blade. Every conversation she had drew powerful people into her orbit. Senators sought her opinion. Business leaders hung on her every word. She didn't just attend the gala, she dominated it. "She used to teach literature at the university," Constance said quietly beside him, her voice carrying a strange note he'd never heard before. "I had my assistant do some research after I saw your reaction. Professor Vera Rice. Disappeared 8 years ago, right around the time we got engaged." Colton's blood turned to ice water. "Constance, don't." Her perfectly modulated voice carried a warning. "Whatever happened between you two, I can see it written all over your face. You look at her the way you've never looked at me, like she hung the moon and stars." Before he could respond, she was gone, gliding away through the crowd toward the bar. Colton stood alone in his $1,000 tuxedo, feeling more exposed than if he'd been naked in Times Square. His phone buzzed, a text from his private investigator. "Need to talk. Urgent. What you don't know about Vera Rice could destroy you." The rest of the gala passed in a blur. Colton made appropriate conversation, smiled at appropriate moments, and wrote appropriate checks, all while his mind raced through possibilities. What had Vera become in 8 years? How had she amassed this kind of wealth and influence? And, most importantly, what exactly did she plan to do with it? By the time he reached his Bentley, his shirt was soaked with sweat, despite the evening's cool temperature. He drove through Savannah's empty streets in a daze, passing buildings and landmarks that now felt tainted by the knowledge that she was back, that she owned pieces of his world. His family estate loomed ahead, 3 stories of antebellum grandeur that had housed 5 generations of Jordans. Old money, old power, old secrets. Tonight, it felt like a mausoleum. Constance was waiting in his study, still in her gala gown, but with her carefully constructed mask finally slipped. In her hands was a thick manila folder. "Your investigator stopped by," she said, her voice carrying a deadly calm, that he'd never heard before. Apparently, he's been keeping tabs on a certain literature professor for longer than you might expect. She dropped the folder on his mahogany desk, photographs spilling across the leather surface. Images of Vera through the years, thin and struggling, working multiple jobs, pregnant and alone, building something from nothing with determination that showed in every line of her body. She was pregnant, Constance said, each word dropping like a stone into still water. 8 years ago. Right around the time you chose me over her. Colton's legs gave out. He collapsed into his desk chair, staring at photographic evidence of the choice that had haunted every day since. Vera, visibly pregnant, leaving their old apartment building with a single suitcase. Vera, working at a coffee shop with her belly swollen beneath a cheap uniform. Vera, alone in a hospital room, giving birth to triplets, Constance continued with surgical precision. 3 daughters, Ivy, Rose, and June Rice, 8 years old, brilliant, beautiful, and completely unaware that their father is the man who abandoned their mother when she needed him most. The photographs showed them, 3 little girls who carried his features mixed with Vera's strength, his daughters, 3 human beings who existed in the world without knowing his name, raised by a woman who'd turned his abandonment into armor. She didn't get rid of it, he whispered, the words scraping against his throat like broken glass. She kept the babies. She kept them, raised them alone, and built a media empire while doing it. Constance's voice carried a mixture of grudging admiration and cold fury. Your investigator says she's worth over $2 billion. She owns properties throughout the South, has connections in every major media market, and commands the kind of influence that money can't buy. She leaned across the desk, her perfect face twisted with emotion he'd never seen before. She's everything I never was, isn't she? Real, substantial, someone who'd fight for what she loved instead of just playing house in your family's shadow. Colton couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't process the magnitude of what he'd lost and what was coming for him. 8 years ago, he'd chosen his inheritance over love, security over courage, his father's approval over his own heart. He'd told himself it was the practical choice, the smart choice, the choice that would secure his future. Instead, he'd created his own destruction. Vera Rice had spent 8 years becoming the kind of woman who could end him with a phone call, and she'd done it all while raising the daughters he'd never known existed. The woman he'd discarded had become a queen, and queens, he was beginning to understand, did not forgive those who'd wronged them. They destroyed them. Chapter 3. The children he never knew. The greatest victories Vera had discovered were not won in boardrooms or courthouses, but in the quiet moments when love proved stronger than abandonment. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Rice family mansion, casting golden patterns across Italian marble floors that had cost more than most people's homes. But Vera Rice, still in her silk pajamas and cashmere robe, cared nothing for the opulence surrounding her. Her attention was focused entirely on the 3 most precious treasures in her empire. The morning ritual in the Rice household was sacred. No phones, no business calls, no assistants, just a mother and her daughters sharing the first hour of each day together. It had been this way since they were babies, this protected time when the outside world couldn't intrude on the family Vera had built from nothing. "Mama, you were magnificent last night," 8-year-old Ivy announced from her perch at the breakfast table, her dark eyes, so like her father's, sparkling with pride. "I watched the live stream on my tablet. You made that man look like he'd seen a ghost." The breakfast table itself was a work of art. Hand-carved mahogany from trees that had grown for centuries, set with china that had belonged to European royalty before Vera acquired it at auction. But it was the conversation, not the setting, that made these moments precious. Vera smiled, settling into her chair beside her eldest daughter. Ivy had inherited Colton's analytical mind, but paired it with Vera's fierce determination. At 8, she was already reading at a high school level, asking questions that made Vera's Harvard-educated lawyers nervous, and displaying a strategic intelligence that would make Fortune 500 CEOs envious. The child psychologists Vera consulted had confirmed what she'd suspected. Ivy's IQ tested at genius level, but more importantly, she possessed the kind of emotional intelligence that couldn't be taught. She understood power dynamics, read people's motivations like open books, and had an instinctive grasp of strategy that would serve her well in the empire she would one day inherit. "A lady never makes anyone look foolish, sweetheart," Vera corrected gently, though her smile held secrets. "She simply allows them to reveal themselves." "That's the same thing," Rose piped up from across the table, her soft voice carrying unexpected wisdom. Where Ivy was sharp edges and brilliant intellect, Rose was empathy and emotional intelligence beyond her years. She could read people's hearts the way her sister read books, instinctively and completely. Rose had been tested by the same child psychologists, and while her IQ matched her sister's, her gifts lay in different areas. She could sense emotional undercurrents in any room, understood suffering in ways that made adults uncomfortable, and possessed a healing presence that drew wounded creatures to her, like moths to gentle flame. Even the household staff sought her out when they were troubled, instinctively understanding that this 8-year-old carried wisdom far beyond her years. The dining room overlooked meticulously maintained gardens that stretched for 3 acres, complete with a playground that had been designed by the same firm that created equipment for European royalty. But the girls rarely played on the expensive structures. They preferred the secret fort they'd built in the ancient oak tree at the property's edge, the one place that was entirely theirs. June, the artist of the family, looked up from the elaborate sketch she was creating in her breakfast journal. A different drawing every morning, each one capturing some detail that had caught her attention. Today's sketch showed her mother as a warrior queen, complete with armor that looked suspiciously like the business suit Vera had worn to the gala. "Mama, why did that man look so scared when he saw you? Was he the dragon from our story?" The dragon. For 8 years, Vera had told her daughters a bedtime story about a brave queen who was hurt by a terrible dragon who spent years growing strong enough to face him again. The girls knew it wasn't just a fairy tale. Children always knew more than adults believed, but they'd never pressed for details until they were old enough to understand the full truth. The story had evolved over the years, growing more complex as the girls matured. In the earliest versions, it was simply about a queen who learned to be strong. As they grew older, it became a tale about justice, consequences, and the power of choosing love over fear. Soon, Vera knew they would be old enough to hear the complete truth. "Sometimes, Junebug," Vera said carefully, "people do things that hurt others very badly, and sometimes those people have to face the consequences of their choices." She studied her daughters' faces, seeing traces of the man who'd tried to erase them before they were born. Ivy had his stubborn chin and brilliant mind, but she'd learned to use both in service of justice rather than selfishness. Rose had his thoughtful eyes and gentle nature, but she'd been raised to extend that gentleness to those who deserved it rather than those who demanded it. June had his artistic hands and creative soul, but she'd been taught to create beauty that healed rather than beauty that merely decorated the lives of the privileged. They were his children, but they were entirely hers. Every value, every priority, every instinct they possessed had been carefully cultivated by a woman who understood that raising daughters meant raising future queens. "Are we going to face the dragon together?" Ivy asked, her 8-year-old voice carrying steel that would make boardroom executives nervous. "We are," Vera confirmed, "but first, you 3 have school, and I have some very important business to handle." The girls exchanged looks that spoke of shared secrets and unshakable loyalty. They knew their mother was planning something significant. They also knew that whatever it was, it would be justice served with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Vera had spent 8 years preparing them for this moment in ways they didn't fully understand yet. The private lessons in negotiation tactics disguised as games. The language instruction that had given them fluency in Spanish, French, and Mandarin by age 6. The chess tournaments where they'd learned to think strategically. The debate team that had taught them to argue persuasively. All of it had been training for the empire they would inherit, the battles they would fight, the power they would wield with wisdom their father had never possessed. After breakfast, Vera walked her daughters to the circular driveway where their armored Mercedes waited. The vehicle looked like any luxury SUV, but it had been customized with security features that could protect them from anything short of military assault. The glass was bulletproof, the body reinforced with steel plating, the communication system encrypted to government standards. Phoenix held the door open, his expression carefully neutral as always, but she caught the slight nod of approval he gave her. Even he understood that last night had been the opening move in a chess game 8 years in the making. He'd been with her for 3 years, lured away from a tech mogul in Silicon Valley by the promise of being part of something unprecedented, the systematic destruction of old money by new power. "Mrs. Rice," he said quietly as the girls settled into their seats, "I've scheduled your morning meetings as requested. The Heritage Foundation Board convenes at 10, followed by your lunch with the Mayor's Economic Development Committee. The Jordan Industries stockholders' meeting is this afternoon." The precision of the schedule wasn't accidental. Every meeting, every appointment, every carefully orchestrated encounter was designed to tighten the noose around Colton Jordan's neck 1 degree at a time. Perfect. Vera kissed each daughter goodbye, breathing in the scent of their shampoo and the innocence they still carried despite the storm brewing around them. "Remember, girls, we are queens who bow to no one," they recited in unison, their voices carrying the conviction of a battle cry learned at their mother's knee. As the Mercedes pulled away, taking her daughters to the most exclusive private school in Savannah, which she now owned through a subsidiary, Vera allowed herself a moment of pure maternal pride. They were everything Colton Jordan would never be: brave, loyal, unashamed of who they were. The school itself was a testament to Vera's forward planning. She'd acquired it 2 years earlier, not through hostile takeover, but through careful negotiation with a board of directors who'd recognized her vision for educational excellence. Now it served the dual purpose of giving her daughters the best education money could buy, while ensuring their safety through her complete control of the environment. The other parents whispered about the mysterious VM Rice. Some in admiration, others in jealousy, most in respectful fear. They knew she was powerful, but they didn't understand the scope of her influence or the precision of her planning. Their children attended school with future empresses, and they had no idea they were witnessing history in the making. Back in her study, Vera reviewed the morning's intelligence reports. Her team of private investigators, lawyers, and business analysts had spent the night compiling everything about Colton's current situation. The results were more delicious than she'd dared hope. Jordan Industries was hemorrhaging money faster than a severed artery. 3 failed product launches in the past 2 years had shaken investor confidence. His marriage to Constance was a hollow shell, maintained for appearances, separate bedrooms, separate lives, separate bank accounts that were all monitored by financial institutions Vera now controlled through various holdings. Most importantly, Colton's father, Harrison Jordan, was desperate to maintain the family's social standing despite their declining finances. He'd made enemies throughout Savannah's business community with his arrogance and outdated attitudes toward women and minorities. Those same enemies were now Vera's allies, eager to support someone who represented the future rather than the past. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jasmine, her best friend and business partner. Saw the news footage. You looked like a goddess of war. Coffee later. I want details about Operation Dragon Slayer. Vera smiled, remembering the scared graduate student who'd called Jasmine crying in the middle of the night 8 years ago. Jasmine had been there through everything, holding her hair while she vomited from morning sickness, helping her study for business school while 3 babies slept in bouncy seats, celebrating every victory and supporting her through every setback. If Vera was the queen of this empire, Jasmine was her most trusted general and the closest thing her daughters had to a second mother. At 10 o'clock sharp, Vera walked into the Heritage Foundation boardroom, wearing a power suit that cost more than most people's cars. The 12 board members, all old money Savannah elite, rose when she entered. 8 years ago, they wouldn't have acknowledged her existence. Today, they treated her like royalty because they understood that's exactly what she was. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd addressed Congress and commanded Fortune 500 boardrooms, "I'd like to discuss expanding our preservation efforts to include some of Savannah's most historically significant properties." She activated the presentation screen, revealing architectural plans and financial projections that had taken her team months to prepare. Every detail was perfect, every angle considered, every potential objection anticipated and neutralized. "Specifically, I'm proposing that the foundation acquire and restore the Jordan family estate." The room went dead silent. Everyone knew the Jordan mansion. 5 generations of old money, antebellum grandeur, the crown jewel of Savannah's historic district. They also knew it wasn't for sale, though Vera's financial analysts had discovered vulnerabilities that made such concerns irrelevant. "Ms. Rice," the board chairman ventured carefully, "the Jordan estate has been in the family since 1847. I'm quite certain Mr. Jordan would never consider selling." Vera's smile was radiant and terrible. "Actually, recent financial analysis suggests that Mr. Jordan may not have a choice. The property carries significant debt, and there are some interesting tax issues that could force a sale. The foundation would be doing the Jordan family a tremendous favor by offering to preserve their legacy." She clicked to the next slide, revealing a comprehensive financial profile of Jordan Industries and the family's assets. The numbers painted a picture of a dynasty in decline, propped up by loans and leverage to the breaking point. Every debt, every liability, every financial vulnerability had been catalogued with the thoroughness of a military intelligence report. "Of course," Vera continued with silk-wrapped steel in her voice, "the foundation would need to ensure that any acquisition serves the public good. We wouldn't want historical properties to remain in private hands if the owners couldn't properly maintain them." The board members exchanged glances that spoke volumes. They understood exactly what she was offering, a chance to acquire one of Savannah's most prestigious properties while appearing to act in the public interest. They also understood that refusing Vera Rice was not an option any of them were prepared to consider. "What exactly are you proposing, Ms. Rice?" the chairman asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I'm proposing that we give the Jordan family an opportunity to do the right thing," she replied with devastating calm, "before circumstances force them into a less dignified arrangement." By lunch, word of the Heritage Foundation's interest in the Jordan estate had spread throughout Savannah's business community like wildfire. Vera's afternoon meeting with the Mayor's Economic Development Committee provided the perfect opportunity to plant additional seeds of doubt about Jordan Industries' stability and the family's ability to maintain their historic properties. That evening, she returned home to find her daughters working on homework at the kitchen table. A scene of domestic normalcy that belied the calculated destruction she was orchestrating. The kitchen itself was a study in understated luxury, with appliances that could have equipped a Michelin-starred restaurant and a breakfast nook that overlooked gardens designed by the same landscape architect who'd created the grounds at Versailles. "How was school?" she asked, settling beside them with a glass of wine that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. "Mrs. Patterson said something interesting in history class," Ivy reported with 8-year-old seriousness. "She said that the most successful military campaigns aren't won through force, but through superior strategy and preparation." Vera raised an eyebrow, wondering if her daughter's teacher was more perceptive than she'd realized. "Did she now?" "I think she was talking about your war with the dragon," Rose added quietly. "Sometimes grown-ups think children don't understand, but we do." June looked up from her art homework, a detailed sketch of a queen standing victorious over a fallen dragon. The artistic skill was remarkable for an 8-year-old, but it was the symbolism that caught Vera's attention. The queen in the picture wasn't celebrating. She was simply standing, crown gleaming, over something that was no longer a threat. "Will the dragon learn to be sorry, Mama? Or will he just disappear?" Vera studied her youngest daughter's drawing, seeing wisdom beyond her years in the careful details. The dragon wasn't destroyed through violence. It had simply been reduced to something too small to matter. "Some people learn to be sorry too late, baby girl," she said softly, "and some people discover that sorry isn't enough to fix what they've broken." That night, after tucking her daughters into their beds and listening to their prayers, which included asking God to help their mama be brave and to make sure justice was served, Vera stood at her bedroom window overlooking the Jordan estate. Lights glowed in the windows of the mansion, where Colton was probably staring at photographs of the daughters he'd never known, finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd lost. The view from her window wasn't accidental. She'd purchased this particular mansion specifically because it offered a perfect line of sight to the home where Colton had been raised, where he'd learned the values that had made him capable of abandoning a pregnant woman, where he now lived with the consequences of choosing inheritance over love. 8 years ago, he'd told her she was nothing, that she was disposable, that the children growing inside her were inconvenient complications to be handled. Tomorrow, she would begin showing him exactly what nothing looked like, but tonight she would sleep peacefully in the knowledge that her daughters were safe, loved, and being raised to understand that true power came not from destroying others, but from building something so magnificent that destruction became irrelevant. The dragon in their bedtime story would fall not because the queen was cruel, but because she had become too powerful for his cruelty to touch. Chapter 4. The First Strike War, Vera had learned from 8 years of building an empire, was not won through dramatic gestures, but through the surgical removal of everything your enemy believed was untouchable. The Savannah Historic Preservation Society's emergency board meeting convened at 9 in the morning in a mahogany-paneled conference room that had witnessed a century and a half of the city's most consequential decisions. 12 of the South's most influential preservation advocates sat around a table that had been carved from trees older than the nation itself, but none of them commanded the room like the woman who entered precisely at 9 o'clock. Vera Rice wore power like other women wore perfume, subtly but unmistakably. Her cream-colored Chanel suit whispered wealth with every movement, and the vintage Hermès briefcase she carried had belonged to a French aristocrat before the Revolution. Everything about her presence suggested old money and older power, which made her next words all the more devastating. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd addressed Senate subcommittees and Fortune 500 boardrooms, "we have an opportunity to preserve one of Savannah's most historically significant properties, the Jordan family estate." The reaction was immediate and electric. Board members exchanged glances that spoke of social implications they all understood, but none dared voice. The Jordan mansion wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of Savannah's antebellum aristocracy, a monument to 5 generations of influence that had shaped the city's power structure. Margaret Beaumont, whose own family had arrived on the Mayflower, leaned forward with interest. "Ms. Rice, The Jordan estate has been in the family since before the Civil War. Surely they wouldn't consider... Consider? Vera's smile was silk wrapped around steel. Mrs. Beaumont, I'm afraid the Jordan family may not have the luxury of choice much longer. She activated the presentation system with practiced efficiency, revealing financial documents that painted a devastating picture: tax liens, overdue mortgage payments, business loans secured against the property, 8 years of fiscal irresponsibility laid bare in numbers that couldn't lie. The property carries approximately $4 million in debt, Vera continued with clinical precision. Property taxes haven't been paid in 18 months. The city has the legal authority to force a sale to recover unpaid obligations. Thomas Whitfield, whose banking family had financed half of Savannah's reconstruction after Sherman's march, studied the documents with growing alarm. These figures, are you certain of their accuracy? My accountants are very thorough, Vera replied, though she didn't mention that those same accountants had spent 2 years strategically acquiring the various loans and liens that now trap the Jordan estate like a spider's web. The Heritage Foundation could step in to preserve this irreplaceable piece of our city's history, but we would need to act quickly. She clicked to the next slide, revealing architectural restoration plans that would have taken months to prepare. Every detail was perfect, from historically accurate paint colors to authentic period landscaping. She'd obviously been planning this acquisition for years. The foundation's offer would be generous, she continued, $15 million, which would cover all outstanding debts and provide the Jordan family with enough capital to maintain their lifestyle while transitioning to a more manageable property. What she didn't mention was that $15 million was exactly half what the estate was actually worth, or that she'd spent the past 3 years ensuring that no other buyers would be in a position to make competing offers. The vote was unanimous. By 10:30, news of the Heritage Foundation's interest in the Jordan estate was spreading through Savannah's business district like wildfire. By 11, it had reached the Jordan Industries headquarters, where Colton sat in his corner office staring at legal documents that confirmed his worst fears. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Jordan, your father is here to see you." Harrison Jordan entered without waiting for permission, his 70-year-old frame still imposing despite the tremor in his hands that spoke of too much bourbon and too many cigars. The patriarch of the Jordan dynasty had built his fortune through calculated cruelty and social manipulation, but today he looked like a man facing his own mortality. "Tell me this is some kind of mistake," he demanded, throwing a copy of the morning's financial analysis onto Colton's desk. "Tell me that Rice woman isn't actually trying to steal our family home." Colton looked at his father, really looked at him for perhaps the first time in years. Harrison Jordan had orchestrated Vera's destruction 8 years ago with the casual indifference of a man swatting flies. He'd threatened her career, her reputation, her future, all to ensure his son married someone more suitable to the family's social standing. "It's not a mistake," Colton said quietly. "She owns our debt, Dad, all of it. The mortgage, the business loans, even the credit lines we've been using to maintain appearances. She's been buying our paper for years." "That's impossible. I would have known." "Would you?" Colton's voice carried 8 years of suppressed anger. "Did you know she was pregnant when you threatened to destroy her? Did you know she kept the babies and raised them alone while building a media empire? Did you know she's worth more than our entire family fortune?" Harrison's face went pale. "Babies? What babies?" "3 daughters, my daughters, 8 years old and brilliant and beautiful, and they don't even know I exist because you convinced me that reputation mattered more than love." The older man collapsed into a leather chair that had belonged to 3 generations of Jordan patriarchs. "Colton, you have to understand. I was protecting our legacy. You were protecting your pride." Colton stood, 8 years of guilt and rage finally finding its voice. "You couldn't stand the thought of your son marrying a scholarship student. even though she was worth 10 of any debutante in this city. So you destroyed her, and now she's come back to destroy us." His phone rang. His secretary's voice was carefully neutral. "Mr. Jordan, Ms. Rice is here to see you." The oxygen seemed to leave the room. Harrison's trembling hands gripped the chair arms as though he could anchor himself against the storm that was coming. "Send her in," Colton said. Vera entered his office like a conquering general claiming enemy territory. She wore victory in the set of her shoulders, in the confident click of her heels against marble floors, in the way she surveyed the room as though calculating its worth down to the last penny. Her gaze settled on Harrison Jordan with the cold intensity of a predator studying prey. "Mr. Jordan, how nice to see you again." The old man tried to summon his former authority, but 8 years of guilt and the weight of imminent destruction had broken something fundamental in him. "Ms. Rice, I trust we can discuss this situation like civilized people." Civilized. Vera's laugh was like crystal shattering. "The way you were civilized when you threatened to destroy a pregnant graduate student's entire future. When you called me trailer trash and told your son I was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience." She moved to the window overlooking Savannah's skyline, where her own corporate headquarters rose like a gleaming monument to everything she'd built from the ashes of Harrison Jordan's cruelty. "I remember every word you said to me in this office 8 years ago," she continued with deadly calm. "How you'd make sure I never taught at any university in the South. How you'd destroy my reputation so thoroughly that no one would hire me for anything more than minimum wage work. How my bastard child, your exact words, would grow up knowing it was unwanted." Harrison tried to speak, but no words came. The architect of Vera's destruction was face to face with what his cruelty had created, not a broken victim, but an avenging angel with the power to end everything he'd built. "The Heritage Foundation's offer is more than generous," Vera said, placing a leather folder on Colton's desk. $15 million for the estate, which will cover your debts and give you a fresh start. The alternative is foreclosure, bankruptcy, and the public humiliation of watching your family legacy sold at auction." She turned to face both men, her expression serene as a Madonna and twice as dangerous. "You have 48 hours to decide. After that, the city will begin proceedings to recover unpaid taxes, and I suspect other creditors will follow suit. It would be unfortunate if the Jordan name became synonymous with financial irresponsibility." Colton found his voice. "Vera, please, if this is about the children, if this is about what happened between us—" "This isn't about what happened between us," she replied with devastating precision. "This is about what happened to me. What you allowed to happen, what you participated in." She moved toward the door, then paused, her hand on the crystal handle. "Your daughters are exceptional, by the way. Ivy is reading at a high school level and speaks 3 languages. Rose has an IQ that would make Mensa weep with joy. June creates art that would make Picasso jealous. They're everything you'll never deserve to know." The door closed behind her, with a soft click that sounded like a guillotine blade falling. Harrison Jordan aged 10 years in the following silence. Colton stared at the contract that would strip away his family's crown jewel, understanding with crystal clarity that this was only the beginning. Vera Rice hadn't returned to Savannah for money or property or even revenge in any traditional sense. She'd returned to show them what power looked like when wielded by someone they'd tried to destroy. And she was just getting started. Chapter 5. The wife's discovery marriage, Constance Wellington Jordan had always believed, was a contract between equals, until she discovered she'd been negotiating with someone who'd already sold his soul. The Hermes teacup trembled in Constance's perfectly manicured hands as she stared at the photographs scattered across her Louis XV escritoire like evidence of a crime she'd been too naive to recognize. 5 years of marriage reduced to lies, and she'd been too busy playing the perfect society wife to notice that her husband's heart had never belonged to her. Vera Rice at 24, radiant and scholarly in a university library. Vera Rice at 25, glowing with pregnancy and love in Colton's arms. Vera Rice at 26, alone in a hospital room, holding 3 newborn babies while the man who'd promised her forever was announcing his engagement to another woman in the society pages. Mrs. Jordan, her personal assistant, Margaret, hovered in the doorway of the morning room with the careful deference of someone who understood that privilege could evaporate as quickly as it had been granted. "The car is ready for your lunch appointment." "Cancel it." Constance's voice was steady, but something fundamental had shifted in her universe. The perfect life she'd constructed, charity galas, country club memberships, society photographer spreads, all of it built on a foundation of lies. Cancel everything for the rest of the week. After Margaret retreated, Constance returned to the photographs with the fascination of someone examining her own autopsy. Her private investigator had been thorough, perhaps too thorough. 8 years of Vera Rice's transformation from abandoned graduate student to media mogul, documented in meticulous detail. The most devastating images weren't of Vera's success, but of her struggle, working 3 jobs while visibly pregnant, studying for business school exams while her 3 babies slept in bouncy seats, building an empire one sleepless night at a time, fueled by the kind of determination that Constance had never needed to develop. She'd married Colton Jordan believing she was getting a prize, the heir to one of Savannah's oldest fortunes, a man whose name opened doors and commanded respect. What she'd actually gotten was a ghost haunted by the woman he'd destroyed, going through the motions of a marriage while his heart remained buried 8 years in the past. The realization should have hurt more than it did. Instead, Constance felt something she'd rarely experienced in her privileged existence, genuine respect for another woman. Vera Rice had been discarded like trash and had transformed that abandonment into an empire. She'd raised 3 brilliant daughters alone while building a fortune that dwarfed the Jordan family's declining assets. The study door opened without a knock, Harrison Jordan's typical arrogance even in her private spaces. Her father-in-law entered carrying a crystal tumbler of bourbon despite the early hour, his 70-year-old frame somehow diminished since yesterday's confrontation with Vera Rice. "We need to discuss damage control," he announced, settling into her antique chair without invitation. "That Rice woman is trying to destroy this family, and you have connections that could help us fight back." Constance studied the man who'd orchestrated her marriage with the same calculating precision he'd once used to destroy a pregnant graduate student. For 5 years, she'd deferred to his authority, accepted his guidance, played the role of dutiful daughter-in-law. Today, she saw him clearly for the first time. "Fight back," she repeated with dangerous calm. Against what exactly? Against a woman seeking justice for being abandoned while pregnant with triplets? Against someone who built a media empire while raising 3 children alone? Against the consequences of choices you and Colton made 8 years ago? Harrison's face darkened. "That scholarship girl was never suitable for this family. I did what was necessary to protect our legacy." "Our legacy?" Constance laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Harrison, do you know what our legacy actually is? Declining assets, mounting debts, and a reputation built on destroying people who inconvenience us. Vera Rice didn't attack the Jordan family. She simply refused to stay destroyed." She stood, moving to the window overlooking the gardens that would soon belong to someone else. The irony wasn't lost on her. Everything she'd married for was slipping away, revealed as hollow as her marriage itself. "I've been thinking about filing for divorce," she said conversationally, watching Harrison's reflection in the glass as the words hit him like physical blows. "You can't be serious. The scandal..." "The scandal of what?" of leaving a loveless marriage to a man who spent 5 years mourning another woman, of refusing to be part of a family that destroys innocent people to maintain their social standing. She turned to face him directly, and for the first time in 5 years, Harrison Jordan looked uncertain. "I have my own fortune, Harrison, my own connections, my own reputation that has nothing to do with the Jordan name. What exactly do you think you can threaten me with?" Before he could answer, Colton appeared in the doorway, looking like he'd aged a decade overnight. His expensive suit couldn't disguise the hollow look in his eyes, or the way his shoulders carried the weight of 8 years' worth of guilt finally coming due. "Constance, we need to talk," he said quietly. "Yes," she agreed. "We do." Harrison retreated with the cowardice of a man who'd built his power through intimidation and found it worthless against people who no longer feared him. Constance watched her husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, collapse into the chair his father had vacated. "I know you've seen the photographs," Colton said. "I know you know about Vera, about the children." "Your children," Constance corrected. "3 daughters who don't know you exist because you chose your inheritance over your family." "I was 28 years old and terrified," he said, but the excuse sounded hollow even to himself. "My father said he'd destroy her career, ruin her reputation. I thought I was protecting her by stepping away." "You thought you were protecting yourself." Constance's voice carried the authority of someone who'd finally stopped pretending. "And now she's back to show you what protection actually looks like, building something so powerful that no one can ever hurt you again." She moved to her desk, pulling out papers she'd had her attorney prepare that morning. 5 years of marriage dissolved into legal documents and financial settlements. "I'm leaving, Colton. Not because I'm angry, though I should be. I'm leaving because I refuse to be part of whatever's coming next. Constance, please. The family needs—" "The family?" She laughed, the sound sharp as breaking crystal. "What family? Your father, who orchestrates the destruction of innocent women. You, who abandoned your pregnant girlfriend to marry someone more socially acceptable. Where exactly is this family worth saving?" She paused at the door, looking back at the man who'd given her 5 years of empty marriage while loving someone else. "I met them yesterday," she said quietly. "Your daughters, at the Children's Museum, with their nanny. They're extraordinary, Colton. Brilliant and beautiful and completely unaware of how much their father lost when he chose not to fight for them." The color drained from his face. "You spoke to them?" "I watched them from a distance. Ivy was explaining Egyptian hieroglyphics to her sisters. Rose was helping another child who'd fallen and scraped his knee. June was sketching the dinosaur exhibit with the skill of someone 3 times her age." She opened the door, then delivered her final blow. "They're everything you could have been proud of, if you'd been brave enough to be their father. Instead, they belong entirely to a woman who was strong enough to raise queens while building an empire. They don't need you, Colton. They never did. And that's your real punishment, not what Vera's taking from you, but what you gave up when you had the chance to have everything." Alone in the morning room, Colton stared at the divorce papers his wife had left behind. 5 years of marriage ended with the same efficiency Vera was using to dismantle his entire world. His phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "The offer expires at midnight. After that, the city proceeds with foreclosure. Choose wisely." Outside, Constance Wellington drove through Savannah's historic district in her Bentley convertible, feeling truly free for the first time in years. She passed the Rice Media headquarters, where Vera Rice was no doubt orchestrating the next phase of her systematic destruction of the Jordan dynasty. Part of her felt she should hate the woman who'd exposed her marriage as a lie. Instead, she found herself hoping that Vera's revenge would be everything it promised to be: complete, devastating, and absolutely deserved. Some sins, Constance had learned, required total destruction to achieve true justice, and Vera Rice, she suspected, was just getting started. Chapter 6. The Business Assassination. Truth, Vera had discovered, was the most devastating weapon in any arsenal, especially when wielded by someone who controlled how that truth was told. The war room on the 30th floor of Rice Media headquarters hummed with the efficiency of a military operation. Wall-mounted screens displayed real-time financial data, news feeds from across the South, and social media analytics that tracked public sentiment with surgical precision. This was where Vera Rice had orchestrated the downfall of corrupt politicians, exposed corporate malfeasance, and built a media empire that could make or break reputations with a single broadcast. Today, she was preparing to destroy Jordan Industries. "Ma'am, the research teams have completed their analysis," Phoenix announced, his usually impassive expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd witnessed his employer's strategic brilliance for years. "Every piece of information has been verified through multiple sources." Vera stood before the central command screen, wearing a black power suit that whispered authority with every movement. Around her, a dozen of the South's most talented journalists, investigators, and media strategists waited for orders with the reverence typically reserved for generals before battle. "Show me what we have," she commanded, the screen filled with damning evidence compiled over 8 years of patient investigation. Jordan Industries' discriminatory hiring practices, documented through leaked emails and personnel records. Wage disparities that showed women and minorities earning 30% less than their white male counterparts for identical work. Safety violations at their manufacturing facilities that had been covered up through political donations and social connections. But the most devastating material came from security footage that had mysteriously survived 8 years in a digital vault, waiting for the perfect moment to resurface. "This is the recording from February 15th, 8 years ago," Phoenix announced as audio filled the room with crystal clarity. Harrison Jordan's voice, dripping with aristocratic arrogance. "That scholarship girl is nothing more than a gold-digging inconvenience. Make sure she understands that my son's future doesn't include trailer trash and bastard children." Colton's younger voice, weak but complicit. "Dad, maybe we should consider other options." "There are no other options. You'll marry the Wellington girl as planned, and this problem will disappear. Permanently." The recording continued for 12 minutes, documenting in excruciating detail how 2 of Savannah's most prominent citizens had planned the systematic destruction of a pregnant graduate student who'd committed no crime beyond loving the wrong man. "Public release is scheduled for tonight's evening news across all our affiliate networks," announced Catherine Marsh, Vera's head of investigative journalism and a Pulitzer Prize winner who joined the Rice Media empire specifically to expose the kind of injustice she'd witnessed firsthand. "We have confirmations from CNN, MSNBC, and Fox Business for national pickup." "Social media campaign?" Vera inquired. "Trending hashtags are already prepared. Jordan Industries exposed, justice for Vera, corporate accountability. Our social media team estimates 15 million impressions in the first hour." Vera nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose revenge had been 8 years in the making. Every detail had been planned with military precision, every potential countermove anticipated and neutralized. "What about Jordan Industries' response capacity?" "Limited," reported Marcus Chen, her corporate intelligence specialist. "Their PR firm dropped them yesterday after rumors of the pending exposé began circulating. Their legal team is focused on the estate foreclosure proceedings. They're fighting a war on multiple fronts without adequate resources." "Perfect." Vera's smile could have cut glass. "Initiate the campaign." Across the city, in Jordan Industries headquarters, Colton sat in his corner office, staring at financial reports that painted a picture of systematic collapse. 3 major clients had terminated contracts overnight, citing reputational concerns that his assistant couldn't explain. Stock prices were dropping steadily, and his board of directors had called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. His secretary's voice crackled over the intercom. "Mr. Jordan, there's a call from Channel 7 News. They're asking for comment on some kind of investigation." His phone exploded with notifications like a digital avalanche. Text messages from business associates, missed calls from investors, email alerts from news services, social media mentions climbing by the thousands. Every message carried the same ominous tone. "Have you seen the news?" But it wasn't just local coverage. His assistant's panicked voice crackled over the intercom. "Sir, we're getting calls from CNN, Fox Business, MSNBC, The Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and the BBC. They're all asking for comment on the same story." He turned on the wall-mounted television just as every major news network began running identical lead stories simultaneously. A coordinated media blitz that could only have been orchestrated by someone with unlimited resources and 8 years of careful planning. Tonight at 6, an exclusive investigation into Jordan Industries reveals a pattern of discriminatory practices, safety violations, and corporate cover-ups spanning nearly a decade. But our most shocking discovery involves audio recordings from 8 years ago that expose how the company's leadership systematically destroyed the life of a pregnant employee who dared to inconvenience their family plans. The investigation wasn't just thorough, it was surgical. Every piece of evidence had been verified through multiple sources, every legal document authenticated by forensic experts, every witness interview conducted with the precision of a federal investigation. This wasn't journalism, this was warfare conducted through media channels. The audio played in its entirety, Harrison's voice filling Colton's office with the same casual cruelty that had haunted his nightmares for 8 years. But hearing their conversation broadcast to hundreds of thousands of viewers transformed private guilt into public shame. The anchor continued. The woman they targeted was Vera Rice, then a graduate student and part-time instructor. Today, she's the CEO of Rice Media, the largest media conglomerate in the South, with a net worth exceeding $2 billion. This is her story. What followed was a masterpiece of narrative journalism, Vera's rise from abandoned single mother to media mogul, told with the skill of storytellers who understood that the most powerful truth was simply truth told well. Interviews with former colleagues who remembered her brilliance, financial experts who analyzed her unprecedented success, legal scholars who explained how the Jordan family's actions 8 years ago might constitute criminal conspiracy. But the most devastating segment featured 3 8-year-old girls. Ivy, Rose, and June Rice appeared on screen for exactly 30 seconds, long enough to show the world what Colton Jordan had abandoned. They were introduced simply as Ms. Rice's daughters, but anyone with eyes could see the resemblance. Ivy's stubborn chin, Rose's thoughtful eyes, June's artistic hands. Our mama teaches us that when people try to make you small, you grow bigger than they ever imagined possible, Ivy said with 8-year-old wisdom that would be quoted in newspapers across the country. The girls disappeared from the screen as quickly as they'd appeared, but the damage was absolute. 3 beautiful, brilliant children who existed because their mother had been brave enough to defy the men who'd tried to destroy her. Colton's phone rang. The caller ID showed his father's name, but when he answered, Harrison's voice was barely recognizable. "They have everything," the old man whispered. "Every email, every conversation, every backroom deal. It's over, Colton. Everything we built is finished." "Dad, she didn't just survive what we did to her. She weaponized it." The line went dead. By 10 o'clock that night, number Jordan Industries Exposed was trending nationwide. Jordan Industries stock had dropped 40% in after-hours trading. 3 board members had submitted resignation letters. The U.S. Attorney's Office had announced a preliminary investigation into potential civil rights violations. Vera watched the carnage unfold from her penthouse office, sipping wine that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The city lights of Savannah spread below her like jewels scattered on black velvet, a kingdom she'd conquered through intelligence, determination, and the kind of patience that could only be forged in the crucible of absolute betrayal. Her daughters were asleep in their beds, protected by security systems that could stop an army, and loved with the fierce devotion of a mother who'd moved mountains to give them everything they deserved. Tomorrow, they would wake up in a world where their father's name was synonymous with cruelty and cowardice, while their mother was celebrated as a symbol of justice triumphant. Colton Jordan had spent 8 years believing his betrayal was a private matter, a personal failing that affected only the woman he'd abandoned and the children he'd never known. Tonight, he'd learned that some sins were too great for private penance. Some sins required public judgment, and Vera Rice had just delivered the verdict. Chapter 7. The Daughter's Legacy. The cruelest punishment, Colton Jordan discovered, was not losing what you had, but seeing what you could have been, and knowing it was forever beyond your reach. The private investigator's surveillance van was parked across from Savannah Academy for Gifted Children at precisely 3:15, hidden among the Mercedes and BMWs of parents wealthy enough to afford the most exclusive education in the South. Through telephoto lenses that could capture a whisper from 100 yards away, Colton watched his daughters emerge from the school that Vera now owned, just one more piece of his world that had quietly slipped into her control. Ivy Rice stepped onto the granite steps first, her school uniform perfectly pressed, but somehow unable to contain the fierce intelligence that radiated from her 8-year-old frame. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her own worth, who'd been raised to believe that brilliance was her birthright rather than a burden to hide. Rose followed, her gentle nature evident in the way she helped a younger student with a dropped backpack, her movements carrying the kind of innate grace that couldn't be taught. Even from a distance, Colton could see the thoughtful expression that reminded him of his own childhood contemplations, the way she paused to examine a butterfly that had landed on the school's fountain. June emerged last, her artistic soul evident in the sketchbook clutched against her chest, and the way her eyes captured details that others missed. The patterns in the stonework, the play of light through ancient oak trees, the emotions flickering across her sisters' faces. She moved like someone who saw beauty in everything, who transformed the ordinary world into art through pure observation. His daughters, 3 human beings who existed because Vera Rice had been brave enough to choose love over convenience, strong enough to raise them alone, fierce enough to build an empire while ensuring they never wanted for anything. "Sir?" The private investigator, a former police detective named Williams, who'd helped dissolve more marriages than he cared to count, adjusted his telephoto lens. "You want me to get closer? Maybe try to—" "No." Colton's voice was raw with 8 years of accumulated grief. Just watch them." A black Mercedes SUV pulled up to the curb, armor-plated, with windows tinted dark enough to stop bullets, the kind of protection that cost more than most people's annual salaries. The driver was Phoenix, Vera's assistant, but the woman who emerged from the back seat was someone Colton had never seen before. Jasmine Montgomery, Vera's best friend and business partner, had been there through everything, holding Vera's hair during morning sickness, helping her study for business school while 3 babies slept in bouncy seats, celebrating every victory and planning every strategic move that had led to this moment. She was also, Colton realized with growing dread, the aunt figure who'd helped raise his daughters in his absence. "Aunt Jazz," June called out, running toward the car with 8-year-old enthusiasm that made Colton's chest tighten with longing. "Look what I painted in art class." She held up a watercolor masterpiece that belonged in a gallery rather than an elementary school portfolio, a landscape of Savannah's skyline at sunset, captured with technical skill and emotional depth that defied her age. "Baby girl, "This is incredible," Jasmine said, examining the painting with the serious attention of someone who understood that childhood artistry deserved respect. "Your mama's going to frame this one for sure." Ivy approached with more reserved excitement, carrying a thick manila folder. "I finished my independent study project on constitutional law. Professor Martinez said it was graduate-level work. Constitutional law. At 8 years old, his eldest daughter was studying subjects that most adults couldn't comprehend. Colton thought of his own childhood, spent on family estates learning to sail and play tennis, while his brilliant daughter was mastering legal principles that could reshape governments. "Mama's going to be so proud," Rose added quietly, her empathetic nature always focused on others' emotions. "She says learning is the one thing no one can ever take away from us. Learning is the one thing no one can ever take away from us." The words hit Colton like physical blows. Vera had raised their daughters to be unshakable, untouchable, protected by intelligence and education from the kind of vulnerability that had once made her dependent on a man's promises. Through his earpiece, Williams provided running commentary that made everything worse. "The oldest one, Ivy, tested with an IQ of 180 last year. She's already been accepted to Harvard's summer program for gifted youth. Rose volunteers at the Children's Hospital every weekend, reading to cancer patients. The youngest one, June, has art hanging in the Telfair Museum. 8 years old, sir, and she's already had a gallery showing. 3 perfect children who'd been raised by a woman who'd transformed abandonment into armor, who'd used his betrayal as fuel to build something magnificent. They were everything he'd never deserved to know, everything he'd lost when he'd chosen his inheritance over his heart." His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Beautiful, aren't they?" Colton's blood turned to ice. She knew he was here, had probably known he'd come, had probably counted on his desperate need to see what he'd thrown away. Everything about this moment felt orchestrated, as though Vera had anticipated his every move and prepared for it with the strategic brilliance that had built her empire. Another message followed. "Ivy wants to be a civil rights lawyer like her mother. Rose plans to open free clinics for underserved communities. June will use her art to heal the world. They dream big because I taught them they could achieve anything. What dreams did your father teach you to sacrifice?" The messages stopped, but the damage was complete. Colton sat in a surveillance van watching his daughters live lives of purpose and passion, raised by a woman who'd turned his abandonment into their advantage. As the Mercedes pulled away from the school, carrying his daughters to their mansion, filled with love and possibility, Colton made a decision that would haunt him forever. He followed them. The drive led through Savannah's most exclusive neighborhoods, past estates that housed old money and older secrets, until they reached the mansion that had once belonged to his own family. The Jordan ancestral home now belonged to Vera Rice, purchased through the Heritage Foundation with surgical precision and surgical cruelty. Watching his daughters run up the steps of his childhood home felt like watching his own funeral. They belonged there in ways he never had, not because of birthright or inheritance, but because they'd been raised by a woman who understood that true nobility came from character rather than bloodlines. From his position across the street, hidden behind ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss, Colton watched through the windows as his daughters lived the life he'd forfeited. Homework spread across dining room tables, where he'd eaten lonely meals with parents who'd valued reputation over relationships. Laughter echoing through halls where he'd learned to suppress emotions that might inconvenience the family image. Vera appeared in the kitchen window, still wearing the business suit that had probably cost more than most people's cars, but looking like any mother helping with after-school snacks. She moved with the easy grace of someone completely comfortable in her own power, completely confident in her choices. When she kissed each daughter goodnight, a ritual visible through the upstairs windows, Colton felt something break inside his chest. Those should have been his kisses, his bedtime stories, his chance to tell 3 brilliant girls that they could conquer the world. Instead, he was a stranger hiding in shadows, watching a family that had learned to thrive without him. His phone buzzed one final time. "They don't need you, Colton." "They never did. That's not cruelty. That's the gift I gave them when I chose to be enough. Sleep well knowing that your daughters are loved, protected, and completely indifferent to your existence." As he drove away from the home that had once been his, but now belonged to the woman he'd destroyed, Colton understood the true genius of Vera's revenge. She hadn't just taken his possessions, or his reputation, or his future. She'd shown him paradise, and made it clear that he would never be worthy to enter. Chapter 8. The Final Trap. The most beautiful traps, Vera had learned, were the ones that looked like salvation, until the moment they snapped shut around your neck. The press conference was scheduled for 2 o'clock at the Savannah Convention Center, in the same ballroom where the Heritage Foundation had announced Vera's $50 million donation just weeks earlier. But today's gathering would be different. Today, Colton Jordan would attempt to salvage his reputation with a public plea for forgiveness that would become his final humiliation. Vera stood before her bathroom mirror at 6 in the morning, applying makeup with the precision of a warrior preparing for battle. The white Armani suit she'd chosen was symbolic, the color of angels and innocence, of righteousness and moral authority. When she destroyed Colton Jordan today, she would do it looking like justice incarnate. "Mama." June's voice drifted from the doorway, followed by the soft padding of 8-year-old feet across Italian marble. "Are you ready to slay the dragon today?" Vera smiled at her youngest daughter's reflection in the mirror. June understood their family's story better than most adults understood their own lives, not because Vera had burdened her children with details they couldn't process, but because children possessed an innate understanding of fairness that adults often lost. "Yes, baby girl, today the dragon finally falls." Ivy and Rose appeared beside their sister, 3 brilliant faces reflected alongside their mothers in the mirror that had witnessed 8 years of transformation. They wore matching white dresses, their idea, not hers, and expressions of solemnity that spoke of children who understood they were about to witness history. "Will he try to pretend he's sorry?" Ivy asked with 8-year-old directness. "Adults do that sometimes when they get caught being mean." "Probably," Vera replied honestly. "Some people think sorry is a magic word that erases consequences. But sorry doesn't unbreak things," Rose observed, with the wisdom of someone who'd spent her young life helping heal others. "It just means you finally understand you were wrong." Vera knelt to their level, studying the faces of the 3 humans who'd given her purpose when the world tried to convince her she was worthless. "Today, you'll see why Mama spent 8 years building our empire. Not for money or fame, but to make sure no one could ever hurt us the way that man hurt us before you were born." "We know, Mama," June said simply. "You made us unbreakable." At noon, the convention center was packed with media representatives from across the nation. Vera's systematic destruction of Jordan Industries had become a case study in corporate accountability, while the personal story of abandonment and triumph had captured public imagination like few modern tales of revenge. Colton Jordan entered through a side door, flanked by lawyers who'd worked miracles to arrange this press conference. His recent weight loss was evident in the way his expensive suit hung loose on his frame, and the dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights staring at photographs of daughters who didn't know his name. He looked like a man who'd aged a decade in a matter of weeks, which was exactly what he was. The podium was positioned perfectly, close enough to the cameras to capture every expression, far enough from the audience to create psychological distance. Vera sat in the front row with her daughters, a vision in white that drew every camera lens like moths to flame. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colton began, his voice carrying the tremor of someone whose world had collapsed around him. "I asked you here today to address recent revelations about my past and to take full responsibility for choices that have caused immeasurable harm." Vera's expression remained serene, but inside, she felt the familiar thrill of a predator watching prey walk willingly into a trap. "8 years ago, I abandoned the woman I loved when she needed me most. Vera Rice was pregnant with my children, and instead of standing by her, I chose my family's expectations over my own heart. I chose cowardice over courage, and I have lived with that shame every day since." Murmurs rippled through the audience, reporters scenting blood in the water, camera operators zooming in on Vera's unchanged expression. "I want to publicly apologize to Vera and to my daughters, Ivy, Rose, and June, for the pain my abandonment caused. I want them to know that not a day has passed that I haven't regretted my choices, that I haven't wondered who they were becoming, what they were learning, how they were growing." He paused, looking directly at the 3 8-year-olds who watched him with the detached interest of scientists observing a specimen. "I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness. I know that 8 years of absence cannot be erased by words. But I'm asking publicly for the chance to be the father I should have been from the beginning. I'm asking for the opportunity to know the remarkable young women my daughters are becoming." The room erupted in camera flashes and shouted questions, but Vera remained motionless, her daughters beside her like 3 small queens observing a peasant's petition. Then she stood. The room fell silent as Vera Rice walked to the second podium that had been prepared for exactly this moment. Every step was calculated, every movement designed for maximum psychological impact. "Mr. Jordan," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd addressed Congress and commanded Fortune 500 boardrooms, "how kind of you to finally acknowledge my daughter's existence." The sarcasm was surgical, precise enough to draw blood without appearing cruel. "You speak of regret, of wondering about their development. Allow me to satisfy your curiosity." She nodded toward her daughters, who stood in perfect unison. Ivy is fluent in French, Spanish, and Mandarin. She's completing advanced coursework in constitutional law and has been accepted to Harvard's summer program for gifted youth. At 8 years old, she's already planning her campaign for the Supreme Court. Ivy stepped forward, her young voice carrying absolute confidence. "I want to dedicate my career to ensuring that women like my mother are protected by law, not abandoned by the men who claim to love them." The audience gasped. This wasn't a child reciting lines. This was a brilliant young woman declaring war on injustice. Rose volunteers at 3 different charities, speaks 5 languages, and has been accepted to Johns Hopkins Accelerated Medical Program. She plans to open free clinics in underserved communities. Rose's voice was softer, but no less powerful. "I want to heal people who've been hurt by others' selfish choices." June has pieces in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's children's collection, has illustrated 2 published books, and was recently commissioned to create a mural for the UN building celebrating resilience in the face of abandonment. June's artistic soul shone through her words. "I paint the beauty that grows when people choose love over fear." Vera looked directly at Colton, her expression serene as a Madonna and twice as dangerous. These remarkable young women were raised to believe they could achieve anything because their mother fought for them when their father chose not to. "They don't need your acknowledgement, Mr. Jordan. They don't require your presence. They are complete because I made sure they would be." She paused, letting the silence stretch until every person in the room understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. "You speak of wanting to be the father you should have been from the beginning. But fathers aren't made by DNA or public apologies. They're made by showing up, by changing diapers at 3 in the morning and reading bedtime stories and wiping away tears and celebrating victories. Her voice rose with 8 years of suppressed fury transformed into elegant destruction. You had 8 years to find us, Mr. Jordan. 8 years to fight for your children. Instead, you married someone more suitable to your social circle and played house in your family mansion while your daughters learned to tie their shoes, read their first words, and discover their extraordinary gifts. The coup de grace came with devastating simplicity. My daughters know exactly who their father is. He's the man who chose not to be their father, and they're grateful because his abandonment taught them that they're strong enough to build empires without needing anyone's permission. Colton's face crumpled as 8 years of carefully constructed public persona shattered on live television. Vera turned to leave, her daughters following like a royal procession. "Vera, please," Colton called out desperately. "They're my children too." She paused at the exit, delivering her final words to a man who'd just been destroyed on national television. "No, Colton, they're mine. You made that choice 8 years ago, and today the world watched you live with the consequences." As the Rice women walked out of the convention center into brilliant sunshine, Colton Jordan collapsed at the podium, finally understanding that some mistakes were too devastating for redemption. Behind them, they left a broken man and a room full of reporters who'd just witnessed the most perfect revenge in modern history. Chapter 9. The public execution justice Vera Rice had discovered was not blind. It simply waited for the perfect moment to open its eyes and let the guilty see themselves clearly for the first time. The Savannah Heritage Foundation's annual Legacy Gala was the social event of the decade, held in the same ballroom where Vera had first met Colton Jordan 9 years earlier as a naive literature professor with stars in her eyes. Tonight, 500 of the South's most powerful individuals had gathered for what they believed would be a celebration of Savannah's cultural heritage. Instead, they would witness the most spectacular public execution in modern history. Vera stood before her bedroom mirror, fastening a necklace of black diamonds that had belonged to a Russian empress, stones that had survived revolution, war, and the fall of dynasties. Tonight felt fitting for jewelry that had witnessed the destruction of empires. Her gown was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, midnight black silk that hugged every curve she'd earned through 8 years of building an empire, with a neckline that whispered power rather than seduction. She looked like a queen of the underworld preparing to claim her throne. "Mama, you look like an avenging angel," Ivy observed from the bedroom doorway, her 8-year-old voice carrying the reverence typically reserved for goddesses. Vera turned to find her 3 daughters dressed in identical white silk dresses, angels to her dark queen, innocence to her justified vengeance. They understood tonight's significance better than most adults in attendance would. "Are you ready to tell the world who we are?" she asked, kneeling to their level for what might be the last quiet moment before everything changed forever. "We've been ready our whole lives," Rose replied, with the wisdom of someone who'd been raised to understand that power came from truth, not titles. "Tonight, everyone will know that we're the daughters he threw away," June added, her artistic soul recognizing the poetic justice in their father's destruction taking place where their parents' story had begun. The limousine ride to the convention center was silent, each Rice woman lost in her own thoughts about the evening ahead. Vera reviewed her speech for the 100th time, though every word was burned into her memory. Her daughters sat with the composure of royalty approaching their coronation. The red carpet outside the Heritage Foundation Gala was a river of camera flashes and shouted questions. Savannah's elite arrived in Bentleys and Maseratis, wearing gowns and jewelry that could fund small countries, but every lens focused on the black limousine that arrived precisely at 7 o'clock. When Vera emerged, the crowd fell silent. She moved like a force of nature given human form, her daughters flanking her like three small princesses escorting their queen to battle. The sight of four beautiful, powerful women claiming their space in a world that had once tried to erase them was enough to stop conversations and redirect cameras. Inside the ballroom, crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across walls that had witnessed a century of Savannah's most significant moments. But tonight would eclipse them all. Colton Jordan sat at his family's traditional table, looking like a condemned man awaiting execution. His father Harrison was notably absent. The old patriarch had suffered what his doctors diplomatically called exhaustion after the media expose, though everyone knew a broken spirit when they saw one. Constance Wellington Jordan was also absent, having filed for divorce 3 days earlier with a statement that praised Vera's strength and condemned the systematic cruelty that had destroyed an innocent woman's life. Even Colton's society wife had chosen justice over loyalty. Vera took her place at the head table as the evening's keynote speaker, her daughters seated beside her like three small judges preparing to deliver a verdict. The sight of them together, the woman who'd conquered Savannah's business district and the children who'd been raised as queens, created a visual that photographers would chase for decades. Mayor Patricia Hartwell introduced Vera with words that painted her as both victim and victor, a woman who'd transformed abandonment into empire and emerged stronger than those who'd tried to destroy her. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to present Ms. Vera Rice, whose remarkable journey from scholar to media mogul exemplifies the resilience and determination that define Savannah's character. Vera approached the podium with the confidence of someone who owned half the room, literally. Through various shell companies and investment firms, she'd been quietly acquiring interests in the businesses, properties, and institutions that defined Savannah's power structure. "Thank you for that generous introduction," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd addressed Congress and commanded Fortune 500 boardrooms. "Tonight, I want to tell you a story about justice, consequences, and the price of underestimating someone you've tried to destroy." The room shifted with anticipation. Everyone present knew pieces of the story, but no one knew what Vera Rice had planned for her public vindication. 9 years ago, I walked into this very room as a graduate student and part-time instructor, invited by the Heritage Foundation to discuss Victorian literature. I was 24 years old, brilliant enough to have earned a full scholarship to one of the nation's most prestigious universities, and naive enough to believe that love could conquer social prejudice. She paused, letting her gaze find Colton across the room. He looked like he'd aged 20 years in the past month, his expensive tuxedo unable to disguise the hollow look of a man who'd lost everything that mattered. That night, I met a man who seemed to share my passion for learning, my hopes for the future, and my belief that two people could build something beautiful together, regardless of their different backgrounds. The room was silent, except for the soft hum of recording equipment and the whisper of expensive fabric as 500 of the South's elite leaned forward in fascination. For 8 months, I believed in a love story. I believed that intelligence mattered more than inheritance, that character trumped social connections, that a scholarship student from a working-class family could be worthy of someone born to privilege. Her smile was radiant and terrible. I was wrong. The screen behind her illuminated with a photograph. Vera at 25, radiant with pregnancy and love, standing beside Colton at a university fundraiser. They looked like any young couple preparing to start a family, unaware that their story would become a cautionary tale about the price of choosing convenience over courage. When I told the man I loved that I was carrying his children, yes, children, triplets, his response was to offer me money to handle the situation. When I refused, He informed me that his future didn't include what his father called trailer trash and bastard children. Gasps rippled through the audience. Even in Savannah's sophisticated social circles, such casual cruelty was shocking when stated so directly. But those weren't his only words. Those weren't the worst of what was said about me and my unborn children. The screen changed, displaying an audio waveform that looked like a heartbeat about to flatline. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to hear exactly what Savannah's aristocracy really thinks about people like me. The recording began, Harrison Jordan's voice filling the ballroom with crystal clarity. That scholarship girl is nothing more than a gold-digging inconvenience. Make sure she understands that my son's future doesn't include trailer trash and bastard children. If she won't take money to disappear, we'll destroy her career, her reputation, and any chance she has of supporting herself or her bastards. Colton's younger voice, weak but complicit. Dad, maybe there's another way. There is no other way. You'll marry the Wellington girl as planned, and this problem will disappear. Permanently. I've already spoken to the university dean about terminating her teaching position. By the time we're finished, she'll be lucky to find work cleaning toilets. The audience gasped audibly. Several society matrons placed hands over their hearts. Camera operators zoomed in on faces displaying shock, disgust, and horror. Board members of major corporations were captured on film, shaking their heads in disbelief. But Harrison's voice continued with even more devastating revelations. Make sure she knows that if she tries to claim paternity, we'll destroy her family too. Her mother works as a seamstress downtown. One phone call and she loses that job. Her brother's trying to get into trade school. Another call and his application disappears. Sometimes people need to understand that crossing the Jordan family has consequences for everyone they love. The recording continued for 6 excruciating minutes, documenting in devastating detail how 2 of Savannah's most prominent citizens had planned not just Vera's destruction, but the systematic punishment of her entire family for the crime of loving the wrong man. Cell phones throughout the audience captured every second. Social media feeds exploded with real-time reactions. The Jordan Family Exposed began trending globally within minutes, accompanied by clips of the most damning audio segments. The silence that followed was absolute. 500 of the South's most powerful individuals sitting in stunned recognition of evil they'd unknowingly celebrated for decades. Vera's voice cut through the shocked stillness like a blade through silk. These men believed they could erase me. They believed that power gave them the right to destroy anyone who inconvenienced their plans. They were wrong. She gestured toward her daughters, who stood in perfect unison, 3 8-year-old angels preparing to deliver judgment. I want you to meet the children they called bastards and inconveniences. I want you to see what I built from the ashes of their cruelty. Ivy stepped forward first, her young voice carrying the authority of someone born to command. My name is Ivy Rice. I'm 8 years old, I speak 5 languages, and I've been accepted to Harvard's summer program for gifted youth. I plan to become a Supreme Court justice to ensure that women like my mother are protected by law, not abandoned by cowards. Rose followed, her gentle nature making her words even more powerful. My name is Rose Rice. I volunteer at children's hospitals, I'm studying advanced medicine, and I want to open free clinics for people who can't afford health care. I learned from my mother that healing the world means helping those who've been hurt by others' selfish choices. June stepped forward last, her artistic soul shining through her words. My name is June Rice. My paintings hang in the Metropolitan Museum. I've illustrated published books, and I create art that celebrates people who choose love over fear. My mother taught me that beauty grows strongest in the places where others tried to plant destruction. The 3 girls spoke in unison, their voices carrying the power of a declaration of war. We are the daughters Colton Jordan threw away. We are the children Harrison Jordan called bastards. We are the inconveniences who became queens, and we are proud to be exactly who our mother raised us to be, women who bow to no one." The standing ovation lasted 15 minutes. Cameras flashed like lightning, capturing the moment when 3 8-year-old girls claimed their throne in the same room where their parents' love story had died. But Vera wasn't finished. "Mr. Jordan," she said, her voice carrying across the ballroom to the broken man at table 12. "You wanted to know your daughters. Now you do. They are everything you'll never deserve, everything you lost when you chose your inheritance over your heart." Colton tried to stand, tried to speak, but no words came. 8 years of guilt and regret had finally found their voice, and it was the sound of absolute defeat. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vera concluded, "thank you for witnessing justice served. Some mistakes are too devastating for redemption. Some choices have consequences that last generations. Tonight, you've seen what happens when someone underestimates a woman who refuses to stay destroyed." As the Rice women walked out of the ballroom together, 4 queens claiming their victory, they left behind a man who'd just learned that some sins were too great for forgiveness. The Heritage Foundation Gala would be remembered as the night Savannah's social order shifted forever, the night her abandoned woman became an empress, and the night 3 8-year-old girls announced to the world that they were born to rule empires. Behind them, Colton Jordan sat alone at his family's table, finally understanding that the woman he'd destroyed had become everything he'd never be, powerful, principled, and completely beyond his reach. Chapter 10. The Empress Rise's victory, Vera Rice discovered, was not a moment but a coronation. The formal recognition of power that had always existed, waiting for the world to acknowledge what it should have seen from the beginning. 6 months after the Heritage Foundation Gala that had become legend throughout the South, Vera stood on the marble steps of the building that had once housed Jordan Industries headquarters. The corporate logo was being removed by workers who handled each letter with the reverence typically reserved for archaeological artifacts, because that's exactly what they were, relics of a dynasty that had fallen to a woman they'd tried to erase. The new sign being installed in its place read, "Rice Empire Headquarters," in letters carved from black marble and inlaid with gold. It wasn't flashy. True power never needed to announce itself loudly. It simply existed, undeniable and absolute. "Ma'am, the ceremony is ready to begin," Phoenix announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd witnessed every stage of the most perfect revenge in modern history. In his hands was a leather portfolio containing the final acquisition documents that would make Vera Rice the sole owner of everything Colton Jordan's family had built over 5 generations. Vera wore a crown, not metaphorically, an actual crown, crafted by Cartier from diamonds that had belonged to European royalty, commissioned specifically for this moment. It wasn't ostentatious, wasn't costume jewelry worn for effect. It was a statement of power so absolute that traditional business attire seemed insufficient to contain it. Beside her stood Ivy, Rose and June, now 8.5 years old, and wearing matching tiaras that proclaimed them princesses of an empire built on their mother's refusal to be destroyed. They weren't props in their mother's triumph. They were partners in a dynasty that would reshape how power was wielded in the South. Inside the building's executive boardroom, 50 of Savannah's most influential business leaders, politicians and media figures had gathered for what was being called the transition ceremony, the formal transfer of Jordan Industries' assets to their new owner. But everyone present understood they were actually witnessing a coronation. The conference table where Harrison Jordan had once planned Vera's destruction now held documents that transferred 150 years of accumulated wealth and influence to the woman they'd tried to erase. Every signature, every seal, every legal formality was another nail in the coffin of the Jordan dynasty. Colton Jordan sat in the back row of observers, no longer significant enough to merit a seat at the table where his family's fate was being decided. He looked like a ghost haunting his own funeral, pale and hollow-eyed, wearing a suit that had once cost more than most people's monthly rent, but now hung on his frame like expensive fabric draped over broken furniture. The past 6 months had not been kind to him. The media expose had led to federal investigations into Jordan Industries' discriminatory practices. His personal reputation was so thoroughly destroyed that former friends crossed streets to avoid acknowledging him. He'd been forced to sell his personal assets to pay legal fees, moving from his family mansion to a studio apartment that Vera's property management company owned, a detail that was absolutely not coincidental. The legal proceedings took exactly 17 minutes, the same amount of time Vera had calculated that it took for her life to be destroyed 8 years earlier when Colton chose his inheritance over their family. But these weren't just local witnesses to her triumph. The ceremony was broadcast live across her media empire, television networks in 12 states, radio stations throughout the South, digital platforms with international reach. Millions of people were watching as Vera Rice formally claimed everything the Jordan family had built over 150 years. Financial analysts provided real-time commentary on what they were calling the most complete corporate takeover in modern Southern history. Rice Empire Holdings now controlled media outlets in 14 states, manufacturing facilities in 8 countries, and real estate holdings worth over $4 billion. When the final document was signed, Judge Martindale smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd witnessed history being made. Ms. Rice, you are now the sole owner of Jordan Industries, its subsidiaries, its international holdings, and its complete legacy spanning 5 generations. You control the largest integrated media and manufacturing empire in the southern United States. May I be the first to congratulate you on building what historians will undoubtedly study as one of the most remarkable rises to power in American business history. The assembled crowd erupted in applause that lasted 7 minutes, applause captured by cameras that would broadcast this moment to business schools, law schools, and women's empowerment conferences for decades to come. Vera stood, the movement causing her crown to catch the light from crystal chandeliers that now belonged to her. Everything in this room, the furniture, the art, the building itself, the very air they breathed, now bore her name and answered to her authority. Thank you, Your Honor, but I prefer to think of this not as an acquisition, but as a reclamation. She moved to the head of the conference table, where a chair that had belonged to 5 generations of Jordan patriarchs waited for its new occupant. But before sitting, she had one final piece of business to conduct. Mr. Jordan, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who now controlled every aspect of his existence, would you please approach? Colton moved through the assembled crowd like a condemned man walking to his execution, which, in many ways, he was. Every step took him closer to the woman who now owned everything his family had built, everything he'd once believed made him worthy of her love. When he reached the front of the room, Vera gestured for her daughters to join her. The 3 girls moved with the confidence of princesses claiming their birthright, their tiaras gleaming under lights that now belonged to their empire. I want you to meet your daughters properly, Vera said with devastating calm. Not as the bastards your father called them, not as the inconveniences you believed them to be, but as the inheritors of everything you were too cowardly to fight for. Ivy stepped forward first, her 8-year-old voice carrying the authority of someone born to rule. Mr. Jordan, my name is Ivy Rice, and I'm going to be the chief executive officer of this company when I turn 18. I've been studying corporate law and business management since I was 6, and I plan to expand our empire into international markets. Rose followed, her gentle nature making her words even more devastating. Mr. Jordan, I'm Rose Rice, and I'm going to oversee our charitable foundation. We're opening free clinics in every city where your family's companies once refused to hire minorities or pay women equal wages. June stepped forward last, her artistic soul shining through her words. "Mr. Jordan, I'm June Rice, and I'm redesigning your family's corporate logo to represent justice instead of privilege. Our new motto will be power earned, not inherited." The three girls spoke in unison, their voices carrying the weight of dynasties being born and empires being claimed. "We are the Rice Empresses. We are the daughters you abandoned who became the queens you'll never deserve to know. And we are proud to be everything you were too weak to fight for." Vera placed her hands on her daughter's shoulders, the gesture creating a visual that photographers would capture and historians would study, 4 generations of strength that no man's betrayal could diminish. "Mr. Jordan," she continued, "you once told me I was nothing, that I was disposable, that our children were inconveniences to be handled. Today, I want to show you what nothing actually looks like." She gestured to the window overlooking Savannah's business district, where Rice Empire properties and subsidiaries controlled nearly 40% of the commercial real estate. "You are now a tenant in buildings I own, buying groceries from stores I own, reading newspapers published by companies I own. Your existence depends entirely on the mercy of the woman you tried to destroy." The coup de grace came with the presentation of a single document. "This is a lease agreement for the studio apartment where you now live. Rent is $50 per month, less than you used to spend on lunch at your country club. Consider it severance pay for 8 years of abandoned fatherhood." Colton's hands shook as he accepted the document that formalized his dependence on Vera's charity. "Why?" he whispered, the questions scraping against his throat like broken glass. "Why not just destroy me completely?" Vera's smile was radiant and terrible, because complete destruction would be mercy, and mercy is something you forfeited 8 years ago. Instead, you'll live every day knowing that your daughters are building empires while you exist on the charity of the woman you abandoned. You'll watch them become everything you could have been proud of if you'd been brave enough to be their father. She moved to the executive chair that had belonged to his great-great-grandfather, settling into it with the natural grace of someone who'd always belonged there. "You'll live knowing that the woman you called nothing became everything, and the children you called bastards became empresses. That's not destruction, Colton. That's justice." As Vera Rice was formally crowned Empress of the largest media and industrial empire in the South, her daughters standing beside her wearing tiaras that proclaimed them inheritors of power earned rather than inherited, Colton Jordan walked out of the building his family had built and into a world where he existed entirely at the mercy of the woman he'd betrayed. The final image captured by photographers would become iconic. Vera Rice seated on a throne of her own making, wearing a crown that represented triumph over abandonment, flanked by 3 8-year-old empresses who'd been raised to believe they could conquer anything. Behind them, through floor-to-ceiling windows, the city of Savannah spread like a kingdom awaiting its queens. The woman who'd been told she was nothing had become everything. The children who'd been called bastards had become empresses, and the man who'd chosen inheritance over love had learned that some choices create consequences that echo through generations. Vera Rice's revenge was complete, but her dynasty was just beginning. Long live the Empress.